For months, the halls of Briarwall echoed with silence. 6-year-old twins June and Wren hadn't laughed since the night their mother, Sarah, was taken from them. Their father, Everett Cole, a billionaire lost in grief and work, could only watch as his daughters slipped further away. Then came Clarissa Boone, a maid with skin dark as midnight and eyes steady as stone, who refused to vanish into the shadows. She spread a worn rug beneath the maple tree and whispered, "On this rug, tears aren't weakness. They're languages." The girls hesitated, until Wren gasped, "Look, Daddy, it's a camp!" June's small voice trembled as she held up a jar of little treasures. "This is for remembering." That night, with blue lanterns glowing and marshmallows hissing over the flame, Everett stormed into the garden, ready to shut it all down. But before he could speak, the twins turned, cheeks sticky with sugar, and cried out a word he thought he'd never hear again. Home. From that moment, everything changed. Support us by subscribing and share in the comments. Where are you listening to this story of resilience tonight? The coastal city of Rockport, Massachusetts wore its September evening like a half-forgotten memory. The Atlantic winds slipping through the spruce and cedar groves with the smell of salt, damp moss, and something resembling forgiveness. The sun had fallen low, throwing long amber shadows across the weathered shingles of the town's fishing huts, and the sky was streaked with pewter-gray clouds that promised rain by midnight, but for now only softened the horizon. Along Briarwall, the sprawling stone estate perched above the coast. Lantern light glittered faintly through the high garden hedge. Briarwall had been silent for months, ever since Sarah Whitmore Cole's funeral. A silence not of peace, but of suppression. The kind that clamped doors and muted laughter. The kind that left every polished hallway echoing with what was missing. But tonight, from the road where a sleek town car slowed into the gravel drive, faint bursts of children's laughter rippled past the hedges like birds startled into flight. Everett Cole, 42 years old, tall and broad-shouldered in his charcoal wool overcoat thrown over a navy cashmere sweater, stepped from the car. His shoes crunched gravel with the precision of a man who managed his schedule down to the quarter hour. His face bore the marks of exhaustion that wealth could not conceal. Gray at the temples of his dark brown hair, fine lines carved beside his hazel eyes from too much squinting at data screens and too little squinting at the sun, a mouth that seemed perpetually braced for negotiation. He was a man who had built a global tech empire on algorithms and mergers, but who, since the death of his wife, had not learned how to sit still in his own house. Inside him, grief had calcified into rules. No disruptions, no clutter, no risks. And Briarwall had become a fortress where silence was mistaken for safety. He did not believe in improvisation, for improvisation had failed him once in the cruelest way, and he had sworn never again. He tightened his coat against the wind, prepared to enter the house, when his eyes caught it. The back garden was alive. Blue lanterns, dozens of them, swung from maple branches and cast soft azure halos across the manicured lawn. Canvas tents huddled in small clusters, as if a miniature camp had sprouted from the earth. From one tent flap spilled two giggling figures, June and Wren, his 6-year-old daughters, twins who mirrored each other in bone and hair but diverged in spirit. June, the quieter, stood tall for her age but carried herself as if she were always bracing against a gust no one else felt. Her auburn hair, long and straight, brushed her shoulders like a veil, and her storm-gray eyes seemed older than 6 years. Wide but wary, hesitant to believe joy was still allowed. She had not laughed, not truly, since the day her mother's coffin was lowered. Wren, by contrast, had auburn hair cut shorter, flaring out like copper sparks, freckles sprayed across her cheeks like constellations, and a mouth quick to grin, quick to argue, quick to pull June into motion. Wren's laughter had always been the louder one, but even she had gone quiet in recent months, as if silence was a dress code in their father's house. Yet here they were now, their cheeks streaked with melted marshmallow, shrieking with delight as they waved sticks in the air like knights brandishing swords. At the center of it all was a woman Everett barely knew, Clarissa Boone, 29 years old, the new housemaid who had been hired on trial only days earlier. Her presence was already an anomaly. Clarissa was not the sort of maid who slipped through rooms invisible. She stood tall, her skin a deep, lustrous black that caught the lantern light like polished stone, her figure strong but graceful beneath the neat black dress and white apron of her uniform. Her hair, thick coils tucked back under a simple headband, framed a face marked by high cheekbones, dark, steady eyes, and lips that rarely smiled wide, but seemed always to hold patience. There was history written into her posture. A girl raised in the South who had learned resilience in cramped kitchens and neighborhood porches, a young woman who once worked as a counselor at a youth camp before financial misfortune forced her into service work, and a caretaker who understood that children needed rituals more than rules. Her long fingers tied knots and built games with the ingenuity of someone who had spent a lifetime making much from little. Tonight, she moved among the tents and lanterns with the quiet authority of a conductor, orchestrating not chaos, but belonging. Everett froze at the patio doors, fury swelling in his chest. Briarwall had strict orders: no fire, no late noise, no improvisations without his approval. He was about to shout when June noticed him, and her eyes widened. For a heartbeat, he braced for her to shrink away, to retreat back into the silence he had built. Instead, she lifted her marshmallow-streaked face, and with a voice rusty from disuse but steady, she called across the garden, "Home!" Wren, her echo and her foil, joined louder, "Home!" The word cracked Everett's composure like glass under heat. They were not calling him Dad. They were not calling Clarissa Mom. They were naming the place itself, something the house had not been in months. Everett's throat tightened, but his instinct returned to control the situation. He stepped onto the lawn, scanning for hazards. The lanterns burned with battery lights, not flame. A metal tin sat near the stones where a gel canister, now extinguished, had been used safely. Even the skewers were capped. He saw safety engineered where he had expected recklessness. Still, his voice came out clipped. "This is not in your role," he told Clarissa, every syllable edged. Clarissa rose from where she had been kneeling, brushing grass from her apron, shoulders back, gaze level. "Mr. Cole," she said simply, acknowledging his authority without shrinking. "No one is in danger. The girls are safe." Her tone was respectful but unyielding. It was the tone of someone who knew that service did not mean silence. She gestured subtly toward the glass jar on the picnic table, half filled with tokens. "We're earning badges, sir. Tie a knot courage. Whisper to the wind. Marshmallow diplomacy." She did not smile as she explained, but the corners of her mouth softened, betraying her intent. It was not disobedience, it was mending. Everett stepped closer. The jar contained small objects labeled in careful black ink: a pebble shaped like a boat, a gull feather found in the hedge, a blue button from his own cuff noted with the words, "Fell while hugging." He frowned. Had he hugged? He must have, without realizing. Beneath those sat a slip of paper that caught his breath. Sarah's handwriting, quick and angled, the last of her notes hidden in odd corners. It read, "Keep Friday soft." His pulse thudded. Sarah Whitmore. Cole had been 39 when cancer stole her voice. She was tall, slender, with red gold hair always pulled back loosely as if paintbrushes mattered more than mirrors, and her eyes were a warm nut brown that turned serious only when she painted. Sarah's gift was turning ordinary afternoons into ceremonies. Baking brownies at midnight with the girls, letting them paint on the kitchen tiles with water, singing the wrong lyrics with a confidence that made the wrong feel right. Her illness had been long enough to plan, too short to accept. In her final week, she left behind notes, hidden everywhere. Let them wear mismatched socks. Say yes to rain. Keep Friday soft. Everett had buried them all in drawers, unable to look, and now one had surfaced in a child's jar, under Clarissa's watch. Before he could gather words, Wren tugged at his sleeve and announced proudly, "We're camping, Daddy. Marshmallow diplomacy means you don't keep the best one, you share it." She thrust a gooey marshmallow at him. Everett, awkward, accepted the stick. He tried to toast another but burned it, and when the marshmallow hissed into the tray, June startled, then let out the strangest sound, half gasp, half laugh. It rose, cracked, and then truly became laughter, sharp and real. Everett looked at her, stunned. He had not heard that sound in months. His eyes burned, but he swallowed it. From the kitchen window, Marjorie Pike watched. Marjorie, 61, was the estate's long-standing housekeeper and unofficial moral compass. Short and sturdy with cropped silver hair, she wore her uniform like armor and her wry humor like a blade. She had seen Everett through his most chaotic college years, through his meteoric rise, through Sarah's decline, and had always believed discipline could cradle tenderness. Yet even she had failed to crack the silence of the twins. Now, watching Clarissa, she pressed her hand to her mouth as though to keep hope from spilling too loudly. Beside her leaned Walt Reyes, the groundskeeper, 55, brown-skinned with crow's feet cut deep from decades in sun and salt air. He preferred the company of soil, tools, and stray creatures to human confrontation. His one-eyed barn cat, Admiral, slunk along the hedges, tail flicking like a metronome, pausing only to permit June's tentative touch before vanishing back into shadow. Walt squinted, eyes misty. He had worked these gardens for 20 years, but tonight, under the lanterns, they looked alive in a way he had forgotten possible. Everett stood stiff among the tents, caught between fury and awe. "We will need to discuss boundaries," he said, the sentence fragile, brittle. Clarissa inclined her head. "Of course, sir. I did not wait for permission to mend what was broken. Next time I'll come to you." She did not add that his door had been locked from the inside for months. She did not need to. Her presence said enough. The twins, oblivious to the charged air, skipped in circles around them, sticky fingers outstretched like banners. Wren shouted, "Say the truest word!" Clarissa crouched beside them. "Last badge," she whispered. "Each of you must say the truest word you can." June hesitated, then whispered, "Home." Wren echoed louder, "Home!" The word shivered the lantern strings, ran across the garden, and cracked open the fortress Everett had built. For a long breath, no one moved. The house seemed to inhale. Everett's eyes blurred, though he forced them steady. Clarissa folded the marshmallow sticks. Marjorie stepped onto the patio with cocoa and cinnamon toast. Walt laid blankets on the grass. Admiral prowled like a sentinel. Everett could have ordered the tents dismantled, the lanterns put away. Instead, he said quietly, "They may stay until the stars look." Clarissa met his gaze and dipped her head once, a silent agreement. The garden glowed. The wind carried laughter like prayer. Everett, for the first time in months, did not feel like a man defending a citadel. He felt, just briefly, like a man standing at the edge of home. Morning in Rockport arrived with a thin mist rising from the sea, clinging to the cobblestones downtown and draping the gardens of Briarwall in silver gauze. The estate, usually as quiet as a museum at dawn, breathed with a different rhythm now. The laughter of the twins from the previous night lingered like perfume in the air, and though Everett Cole had barely slept, he found himself standing by the upstairs window, coffee untouched, watching his daughters chase one another barefoot across the dew-stained lawn. He told himself he was annoyed at the break in routine. In truth, he felt unsettled because something long absent had returned, a lightness he could neither command nor contain. Clarissa Boone had risen early, as she always did, her figure a silhouette against the pale morning haze. She carried with her a rolled-up rug, faded and patched from years of use, its once bright threads now softened to earth tones. She had brought it from Savannah, where it had belonged to her grandmother, a woman who raised children of the neighborhood when their parents worked double shifts. That rug, though frayed at the edges, was more than cloth. It was memory, discipline, and invitation woven together. Clarissa carried it now with the gravity of ritual. She spread it under the wide crown of the maple tree that anchored the garden's north side, a tree older than the estate itself, its trunk rough and scarred from lightning decades ago, but still living, still giving shade. June and Wren trotted over, hair still mussed from sleep, nightgowns spotted with cocoa stains from the night before. Clarissa knelt, her tall frame folding with surprising gentleness, and smoothed the rug flat with the flat of her palm. "This," she told them, "is our rule rug." The girls tilted their heads in curiosity. Wren, the bolder twin, crouched instantly, eyes bright, freckles dotted like stardust across her nose. June hesitated, lingering near the tree trunk, her gray-green eyes cautious, her fingers tightening at the hem of her gown. Clarissa saw both impulses and honored them. She drew out a small notebook, pages browned at the edges, and began to write in neat block letters. She read aloud, her voice low but steady. Rule 1. Hugs are not required, but they are always welcome. Rule 2. Tears do not mean something is broken. Tears are a language. Rule 3. Bare feet make the heart lighter. She placed the notebook in the center of the rug. June's lips twitched, the first suggestion of a smile since the funeral. A smile half ashamed, half curious. Wren exhaled dramatically, as if someone had just unlocked a door inside her chest. She immediately pulled her nightgown over her head, tossed it aside in rebellion, and planted her bare feet on the rug, wiggling her toes in victory. June, after a pause, quietly slid off her slippers and joined, toes curling shyly into the worn fabric. Clarissa nodded, satisfied. From the veranda above, Everett watched, one hand gripping the railing. He was supposed to be reviewing a contract for a new data center in Seattle, but his eyes refused to leave the scene below. He saw June's small smile, the way Wren tilted her head back toward the branches, giggling at nothing but the breeze, and Clarissa seated cross-legged between them like some unlikely queen. A surge of conflicting emotions rushed through him. Anger that boundaries had been crossed yet again. Awe that his daughters looked so alive. Fear that if he intervened too harshly, he might extinguish this fragile resurrection. Clarissa reached for the glass jar she had washed and dried the night before, once used for pickled peaches, now scrubbed of labels. She set it at the rug's center. "This is our jar of small things," she explained, her dark eyes soft. "Every little piece of the day that feels worth remembering, we put it in here. Pebbles, feathers, buttons, even drawings. One day we'll shake it and hear the sound of our own story." The twins leaned forward eagerly. Wren dashed across the grass, scooping up a dandelion puff that had survived the mower blades, and blew until the seeds scattered like tiny parachutes. She placed the stem inside. June slipped away toward the porch steps. She bent down and tugged at something caught between wood and stone, a folded scrap of paper, weather-stained but legible. She smoothed it open with delicate fingers and carried it back, pressing it into Clarissa's hand. The words were unmistakable, written in a quick, slanting script Everett recognized even from the window above. "Keep Friday soft." Sarah's handwriting. For a long breath, Clarissa froze, the weight of the note heavy in her palm. She remembered, as she always did, the story Marjorie had whispered to her upon hiring that Sarah, Everett's wife, had been a painter, tall and lean, with hair the color of autumn wheat. She had loved the untidy and the imperfect, and she had left behind scraps of guidance hidden in strange places after her diagnosis. Clarissa felt the paper thrum in her hand like a relic. She placed it carefully into the jar. Everett, at the window, felt something break loose inside him, though he would never admit whether it was grief or gratitude. He closed the curtain, unable to watch, his throat locked between the urge to shout and the need to weep. Inside the kitchen, Marjorie Pike was chopping apples for a tart, her strong hands steady even at her age. Short and sturdy, with hair like brushed steel, Marjorie had long carried herself with brisk practicality. She had raised her own 3 children alone after her husband, a fisherman, drowned in a storm when she was 35. That grief had never made her bitter, only sharper in her instincts. She glanced through the open window, saw Clarissa's rug, the jar, the scrap of Sarah's handwriting gleaming inside. A pang went through her. She wiped her hands on her apron and returned to her task, but her eyes flicked often toward the garden. At the other end of the estate, Walt Reyes was sanding down a broken gate, his weathered face bent in concentration. Walt had grown up in Gloucester, the son of a Vietnam veteran and a seamstress, and had learned work as his truest language. His one luxury was the company of animals, most recently Admiral, the one-eyed barn cat he had rescued from a fishing dock. Admiral, sleek and striped, padded silently across the patio, tail swaying. The cat paused at the edge of the rug, sniffed the jar, and with the regal disdain only cats possess, turned and curled into June's lap. June gasped, then stroked him gingerly, her first act of wordless courage that morning. Walt, glancing up from the gate, saw it, and a small grin tugged his lips. While joy hummed outside, a shadow sat heavy in Clarissa's pocket. A folded envelope pressed against her chest each time she bent forward. The seal read, Rockport City Council. She had received it the day before but had not spoken of it. Her brother Eli Boone, 31, had spent the last 5 summers running a makeshift camp for underprivileged children at the edge of town. Eli, tall and wiry with cropped hair and a smile wide enough to disarm suspicion, had been born with a gift for drawing laughter from children who had none left. His camp had been his life's work since college. But the letter in Clarissa's pocket was a notice. His permit had been revoked, effective immediately, on grounds of inadequate facilities. Without a permit, the camp would shutter, and dozens of children would lose their one safe haven. Clarissa felt the paper burn through her uniform. She told herself not to dwell, not here, not in front of June and Wren, whose fragile joy she was just beginning to coax into bloom. She tucked the thought deep, resolving to act later. But Marjorie, watching from the kitchen window, noticed the stiff way Clarissa touched her pocket, the shadow that crossed her face when she thought no one was looking. Marjorie knew that look. She had worn it herself in the weeks after her husband's ship never returned. It was the look of someone carrying a burden heavier than her own frame should allow. By midday, the sun broke through the mist, washing the garden in soft warmth. The rule rug lay scattered with tokens. Wren's dandelion stem, June's smooth pebble shaped like an eye, Admiral's whiskers shed accidentally, and in the jar, Sarah's note like a talisman. The twins argued over whose contribution was more important, but Clarissa quieted them by lifting the jar and saying, "Each piece tells the story of today. Without one, the story is incomplete." The girls leaned against her, twin halos of auburn hair brushing her shoulders. Everett appeared at the patio door just then, his tall frame rigid, but his eyes softened as he took in the sight. He wanted to object, to insist that rugs belonged inside, jars were for preserves, and rules for children belonged in books. But he could not speak. He saw June leaning into Clarissa's arm, Wren giggling into Admiral's fur, and the jar glowing with memory. Something inside him wavered, though his lips remained pressed tight. He turned and walked back into the house, leaving the door ajar. Clarissa exhaled. She knew battles lay ahead, but for now, she had won this small one. The girls had smiled. They had spoken. They had named their world again. She brushed a hand over the jar and whispered to herself, "Keep Friday soft, day." The afternoon sky over Rockport had shed its morning silver and was now a pale blue brushed with streaks of cirrus cloud, the kind of sky that suggested calm but carried the hush before a storm. The Atlantic murmured steadily against the rocks below the cliff where Briarwall sat, and inside the estate the air was thick with the sound of silence broken only by the faint creak of the old house as it settled into the hours between lunch and supper. Everett Cole had spent most of the morning pacing between his office and the upstairs corridor, his tall frame restless in his tailored slate-gray suit, his mind pulled in too many directions, contracts waiting for his signature, meetings postponed by his assistant, and the vision of his daughters smiling on the rule rug under the maple tree. He told himself he disapproved of Clarissa Boone's interventions, yet something inside him knew he could not ignore what was happening. His fortress of control was being breached not by enemies, but by laughter, by notes left from Sarah, by tokens sealed in a glass jar that had already altered the air of the house. At the far end of the corridor stood a door he had not opened since the morning after Sarah's funeral. The studio, Sarah Whitmore Cole had claimed the room for herself years ago, transforming it into a gallery of unfinished canvases, brushes standing like soldiers in chipped jars, and shelves stacked with sketchbooks that smelled of graphite and turpentine. She had been tall and slender, with wheat-colored hair always tied into a loose knot, paint smudges often decorating her cheekbones like accidental war paint. Her friends used to say she had the gift of making anyone believe their ordinary day mattered. She would compliment a child's clumsy drawing as if it belonged in a museum, or pause to describe how the light falling across an alleyway looked like spilled honey. Illness had hollowed her but never dimmed her voice. It was life that was cut short, not the way she looked at the world. That room, sealed by Everett, had become a mausoleum to memory, its dust thick, its air stale with unspoken things. Clarissa Boone, tall and straight-backed in her crisp uniform, stood in the hall now with June and Wren clinging to her sides, their auburn heads tilted upward, waiting. Clarissa's dark eyes met Everett's. She did not blink, did not bow her head. "It's time," she said quietly, and though her voice was low, it carried the authority of someone who knew wounds could not heal behind locked doors. Everett's fingers shook as he reached into his pocket for the brass key, its weight heavier than any signature he had placed on corporate agreements. His chest hammered like funeral drums. The twins held their breath. The key slid into the lock with a reluctant scrape, and the door swung open on hinges stiff from disuse. Dust swirled like gray ghosts in the thin light. Yet under the weight of neglect, the faint smell of oil paint lingered, sweet and acrid, memory preserved in pigment. The room revealed itself slowly, canvases leaning against walls, some covered in sheets, others half-finished. A stool tipped slightly on one leg, a cracked porcelain cup that still held 3 brushes with dried bristles. On the central easel stood the last painting Sarah had touched, its colors muted with time but still speaking. 2 small capes, painted in the faint blues and greens she had favored, and beside them the beginning of a word, near. Nothing more, just the fragment of a thought she never completed. June crept forward, a crayon she carried from the rule rug still in her hand. Her gray-green eyes widened at the sight of her mother's lines, and with reverence she reached up and, on a lower corner of the canvas, drew a small golden sun, its rays lopsided but full of warmth. Wren, ever her opposite, snatched a blue crayon from her pocket and scrawled a wavering wave across the bottom edge. The additions were clumsy, but in their clumsiness lived defiance against silence. Clarissa rested a hand gently on June's shoulder, not to stop her, but to steady her. Everett watched, his throat aching. He wanted to order them to stop, to preserve the sacred untouched, but he could not. Instead, the words broke from him, hoarse but resolute. "No more fires," he said, voice shaking. "But I'll join the story time." It was a small concession, but in the language of Everett Cole, it was monumental, a surrender disguised as structure, a vow dressed as compromise. The twins looked at him with wide eyes, surprised, and then delighted. June tucked her head against Clarissa's arm. Wren clapped her marshmallow sticky hands together. Clarissa met Everett's gaze and gave the smallest nod, acknowledgement of a truce. For the first time since Sarah's absence, the studio no longer felt like a tomb, but like a room in which breath could happen again. While the family lingered in the studio, life outside Briarwall continued with its own demands. Clarissa's pocket still held the folded letter she had received 2 days earlier from the Rockport City Council, its edges creased from her thumb pressing against it again and again. That morning she had slipped away briefly to the servants' quarters to read it once more, as if the words might have changed overnight. They had not. Her brother Eli Boone, tall, wiry, with a wide smile and restless energy that children trusted instantly, had devoted years to his summer camp for foster kids and children from struggling families. His camp was little more than a stretch of borrowed land with tarpaulin shelters, second-hand sports gear, and a hand-painted sign, but it was a sanctuary. Now the council had revoked his permit, citing safety violations and lack of facilities. And the final hearing, the only chance to appeal, was set for Friday at 5 o'clock in the evening. Clarissa folded the letter back into her pocket just as Marjorie Pike appeared in the doorway of the servants' hallway. Marjorie, short, sturdy, her silver hair tucked neatly back, had an eye for what others tried to hide. She had noticed Clarissa's distraction, the shadow that pulled at her mouth when she thought no one was watching. "Something on your mind, girl?" Marjorie asked, voice clipped but not unkind. Clarissa shook her head, but Marjorie had raised 3 children alone and recognized the way someone lies to protect others. She did not press, but she carried the knowledge back with her to the kitchen, knowing that sooner or later she would need to confront it. Later that afternoon, Walt Reyes returned from the village with supplies. His truck rattled into the gravel drive, the bed carrying lumber and nails, though his real purpose had been to fetch medicine for Admiral the cat, who had developed an infection in his remaining eye. Walt, sun-worn and taciturn, entered through the servants' gate and crossed paths with Clarissa. She forced a smile, but he caught the exhaustion in her shoulders. Walt was not a man of many words, but he knew when to speak one. "Storm coming Friday," he said, eyes narrowing. "Best be ready." He meant the weather, but something in his gaze told Clarissa he understood there was another storm pressing down on her. By dusk, the studio door remained ajar, its air stirred with new breath. Everett stood at its threshold, hands deep in his pockets, watching his daughters chase each other across the paint-specked floor, their laughter echoing where silence had ruled. He did not step inside, not fully, but he did not close the door either. For a man like Everett, that was its own kind of confession. Friday descended upon Rockport with a clarity that made even the salt-stained harbor sparkle, the kind of light that encouraged fishermen to mend their nets slower and children to skip stones across the tide pools. At Briarwall, the estate that had too long been a mausoleum of grief, the morning carried an unusual electricity. The twins, June and Wren, had risen before dawn and dashed through the halls in bare feet, their laughter spilling into corners that had known only echoes. Clarissa Boone had guided them to the kitchen, her tall frame wrapped in a simple cotton dress beneath her black apron, her ebony skin glowing with the sheen of early work. She hummed under her breath, a hymn she remembered from summers in Savannah while setting out flour, yeast, and sauce. Today was to be a ritual Sarah once whispered about in her hidden notes. Keep Friday soft. Everett Cole entered the kitchen not as the immaculate executive his board expected, but as a man still wearing yesterday's fatigue. He had on a white dress shirt rolled to the elbows, no tie, hair mussed from running his hands through it too many times. For years he had walked past the kitchen without pausing, delegating meals to staff and catering services. But this afternoon he stopped, leaned against the counter, and felt the peculiar hum of anticipation. His daughters tugged at his sleeves, dragging him toward the flour-dusted island. June, with her quiet seriousness, placed a rolling pin into his large hands as if granting him a sword. Wren, freckles dancing, threw a fistful of flour into the air so that the room snowed white. Everett, clumsy and untrained, pressed too hard into the dough. It clung to his fingers, tore unevenly, and when he tried to roll it flat, the pin skittered across the surface. His daughters erupted into squeals of laughter. "Messiest chef!" Wren cried, crowning him with a dish towel. June, reluctant but smiling, nodded solemnly. The kitchen echoed with joy so sharp it startled Everett, and for the first time in years he laughed without checking who was listening. Clarissa, standing at the stove, watched the transformation with quiet satisfaction, though her hand brushed often against the folded envelope in her pocket the notice from the city council. Marjorie Pike entered with her brisk stride, carrying a tray of herbs. Her silver hair was pulled tight, her blue eyes sharper than any blade, but the faintest grin tugged her mouth when she saw Everett covered in flour. She had raised 3 children in a cramped Gloucester home after her husband's ship never returned, and though she was hard on waste and disorder, she recognized that chaos was sometimes another name for love. She set the herbs down, muttering, "Even kings must need bread," before turning to tidy the counter. As the pizzas baked, Walt Reyes shuffled in from the back door, his boots leaving smudges of earth. He was a man of broad shoulders and brown, weathered skin, with a voice gravelly from years of sea wind. In his arms he carried Admiral the cat, the one-eyed Tom now patched and less scornful since receiving his medicine. Admiral's fur, striped in ash and bronze, bristled at the noise, but he tolerated the twins' hands because Walt murmured to him gently in Spanish, promising fish later. Everett raised an eyebrow at the intrusion, but when Wren pressed a flowery kiss to Admiral's head and June whispered, "Stay," he said nothing. The pizzas came out lopsided, one burnt at the edge, another too thick in the middle. Yet when placed on the table, the twins devoured them with delight, cheese stretching in strings, sauce smeared across their cheeks. Everett ate too, and though he would never admit it, he found it tasted better than any catered meal he had paid for. He wiped flour from his jaw with the back of his hand, and Clarissa thought, not without tenderness, that grief was loosening its grip on this man in increments he could not yet measure. Then the sound came, the sharp buzz of Clarissa's phone against the wooden counter. She glanced down, expecting another message from Eli about the camp. Her face paled. The hearing she had been dreading, originally scheduled for the following week, had been advanced. The notice was clear. Final appeal, Friday, 5 p.m. She looked at the clock above the stove. It was already 4. The council chambers were across town. She would never make it unless she left immediately. Her throat closed. She looked at June and Wren, faces glowing with triumph, and then at Everett, who sat unguarded, his shirt smeared with flour, his hazel eyes softer than she had ever seen them. The girls had waited months for this, Friday, soft, laughter alive. Leaving them now would feel like breaking a promise carved into Sarah's last note. But the camp, Eli's camp, was hanging by a thread, and dozens of children with nowhere else to go depended on it. Clarissa froze, torn between two loves that demanded everything. Everett noticed the phone in her trembling hand, the anguish on her face. For years he had responded to crisis with orders, with control. But now, in this kitchen heavy with the scent of bread and memory, he understood something else was needed. He straightened, flour still on his cheek, and spoke in a voice rough but steady. "Go," he said. "I'll keep tonight soft." Clarissa blinked, stunned. The man who never bent rules was granting her freedom, entrusting his daughters to her absence. Her eyes filled, but she swallowed the tears. She nodded once, unable to speak. Wren tugged her sleeve, whispering, "You'll come back?" Clarissa kissed both girls on their foreheads, the warmth of their hair sinking into her. "Always," she promised. Then she turned and hurried out, her apron fluttering like a banner. Walt, seeing the urgency, followed. "I'll drive," he said simply, leading her toward his old truck. As the door closed, the kitchen dimmed slightly. Everett inhaled, steadying himself. He turned to his daughters, who watched him with cautious eyes, testing whether their fragile joy would vanish now. He reached for the storybook Clarissa had left near the counter, but then set it aside. Instead, he began to speak in his own words, his voice low like a lighthouse beam. He told them of a tower on the edge of the sea that did not shout or command, but simply shone its light, steady and patient, guiding ships home through fog and storm. June leaned against his arm, listening. Wren curled into his lap, her laughter fading into a soft hum. For the first time, Everett did not feel like a man out of place in his own family. He felt like the light itself. Meanwhile, across town, the council chambers smelled of dust and old wood. Clarissa and Walt arrived breathless, Clarissa's tall frame rigid with determination, Walt's boots thudding against the marble. Inside sat 3 officials, Mr. Harland, a balding man in his 50s with spectacles perched low, Ms. Rivers, a narrow woman with thin lips and impatient eyes, and Mr. Deacon, a heavy-set councilman with a booming voice. They looked up from their files as Clarissa approached. She pleaded with them, her dark eyes fierce, her voice unwavering. She spoke of Eli's dedication, of the children who found safety in that camp, of nights when bonfires burned not for rebellion, but for belonging. She laid her heart bare in words shaped from every Friday she had promised to keep soft. But bureaucracy is deaf to tenderness. Harlan shook his head, Rivers tapped her pen, Deacon cleared his throat. "The permit cannot be renewed," they said in turns. "The facilities do not meet regulation. Liability is too great." Clarissa's pleas cracked against their walls like waves against stone. Walt shifted, fists tightening, but he knew anger would only worsen things. When the gavel struck, the verdict was final. The camp was closed. Clarissa staggered outside, the cool evening air cutting her lungs. Her tall figure trembled as she leaned against Walt's truck, eyes burning with defeat. Walt placed a rough hand on her shoulder, silent comfort. Admiral, who had followed hidden in the truck bed, slinked onto her lap, pressing his warm, one-eyed head against her ribs. Clarissa stroked him absently, tears finally spilling. The cat purred, indifferent to laws and permits, reminding her that softness still existed in the smallest corners. When she returned to Briarwall later that night, the estate glowed from within. Everett sat cross-legged on the living room rug, his daughters nestled on either side, lantern light flickering around them. His voice carried the end of the lighthouse story. And even when the storm raged, the light did not falter. And so the sailors knew where home was. June's eyes fluttered closed. Wren's thumb slipped into her mouth. And Everett, for once, did not rise to leave the room. He remained, watching them sleep, the weight of grief lifting just enough to let him breathe. Clarissa stood quietly in the doorway, her heart heavy from the council's verdict, but softened by the sight before her. She had failed Eli, for now. But she had not failed these children. She wiped her face, squared her shoulders, and stepped back into the house, ready to carry both burdens until she found a way to lift one. The storm came in fast from the Atlantic, a bruised smear of clouds crawling low over Rockport, the kind of storm fishermen recognized as trouble long before the first drop fell. By evening, the wind howled against the cliff face where Briarwall stood, rattling window panes and hurling spray across the garden lanterns still hanging limp from the Friday feast. Inside the estate, the air smelled faintly of flour and ash from the pizza oven, the memory of laughter still clinging to the rafters. Everett Cole, tall and broad-shouldered in his rolled-up shirt sleeves, had begun clearing the kitchen table with June and Wren still clinging to his arms when the power died. The hum of the refrigerator, the steady glow of recessed lights, the whisper of security systems. Everything collapsed into silence. Then darkness swallowed the house. For a heartbeat, Briarwall was as mute as a tomb. Then came the twins' cries. June's voice cracked into sobs, soft and sharp, her gray-green eyes wide in the sudden dark. Wren shouted louder, calling for her father, arms outstretched as though the dark might carry her away. Everett's instincts, honed by years of controlling chaos in corporate rooms, nearly sent him lunging for the breaker box, for emergency systems, for the structured safety of alarms and generators. He almost barked an order to Marjorie to light the auxiliary panels. But something in the cries held him in place. He remembered Sarah then, not in the tidy way of a photograph, but in the sensory flood of memory. Tall and willowy, hair tied loose with strands always escaping, eyes brown as wet earth. She had carried storms inside her with quiet grace, never matching force with force, but bending like reed and still holding. He saw her as she once had been on another stormy night, pulling the twins under a heavy blue blanket, whispering to them that the thunder was only giants moving furniture in the sky. That blanket still lived, folded neatly in a cedar chest upstairs. Everett moved differently this time. He gathered his daughters against him and climbed the stairs in the dark, his long legs steady even as the wind shook the shutters. In Sarah's old chest, he found it, the blue blanket, soft and frayed at the edges, still carrying her faint lavender scent. He carried it back down to the parlor, where the storm groaned at the glass. From a side cabinet, Clarissa had left her lanterns, the same battery-lit globes of soft light that had transformed the garden nights before. Everett lit them one by one, placing them in a circle around the rug. Their glow was not harsh like the house lights, but tender, golden blue, as though the storm itself bent back from their boundary. He spread the blanket across the floor and sat with June and Wren pressed against him. Their little hands clutched at his shirt, but as the lantern steadied, their cries softened. "We can make our own light," he whispered, voice rough but sure. June, her face still streaked with tears, peered up from the folds of the blanket. Her lips moved, hesitant but insistent. "Are we still your Friday, even today? With the storm?" The question, fragile as glass, cut him deeper than any boardroom betrayal or financial loss. Everett's chest cracked open, grief rushing in and spilling out at once. For the first time since Sarah's passing, he wept openly, tears running unhidden down his face. He drew his daughters closer. "Every day," he managed, the words torn but whole. "Every day." The twins curled into his sides then, their small breaths warming his ribs, their trust heavier than any empire he had built. The storm roared, but it could not touch the circle of lanterns, nor the fortress of the blanket. For the first time in years, Everett was not the overseer of schedules or the warden of silence. He was simply a father, breaking in the best possible way. At the same hour, Clarissa Boone trudged through the rain, her tall figure soaked through, apron plastered to her black dress, curls plastered tight under her headband. In her hand, she clutched the folded denial from the Rockport City Council, the paper softening at the edges from the water but its message unyielding. Walt Reyes had driven her back, his old truck groaning through flooded streets. Admiral, the one-eyed cat, crouched in the passenger seat like a damp sentinel. Walt, broad and silent, had offered her nothing but the rough comfort of presence, and that had been enough to keep her from collapsing. When Clarissa stepped into Briarwall's foyer, dripping and chilled, she found the parlor glowing with lantern light, the storm muted beyond. Everett looked up from the blanket circle where the twins now dozed, cheeks still wet but peaceful. His hazel eyes met hers across the dim. He saw the letter in her hand and understood without words. She crossed the room and placed it into his palm. He did not unfold it. He had seen enough papers stamped with verdicts to know what one looked like. In the old Everett, the response would have been anger scolding Clarissa for disobedience, citing liability, demanding explanations. But tonight he only exhaled, his face lined not with fury, but with resolve. He looked at his daughters, then at Clarissa, and for once he spoke not as a CEO or a widower, but as a man who had remembered light and darkness. "Then we'll open the camp here," he said. His voice was low, steady as the lanterns. "In this garden, in Briarwall. They can't close this door." Clarissa blinked, her chest tight with relief and disbelief. She looked at the twins curled against their father, their auburn heads tucked under his arms, and she knew something in the world had shifted. For the first time since Sarah's death, Everett Cole had chosen not just his own blood, but all children waiting for a place to belong. 1 week later, the storm had passed and Rockport breathed again beneath skies washed clean by rain. The harbor bustled with fishermen repairing lines, and gulls circled lazily over boats glinting in the pale sun. Up on the cliff, Briarwall, once a house sealed against noise and intrusion, now stood with its back gates thrown open. The ironwork, polished and heavy, had always been kept shut to ensure separation between the estate and the town. But today they were ajar, welcoming the shuffle of feet and the chatter of children. The lawn beyond the maple tree had transformed. Where once the grass had stretched immaculate and unused, now tents of every color were pitched in rows, their canvas walls painted with stars, waves, and suns by small, eager hands. Blue lanterns hung from ropes strung between trees, glowing in the afternoon like captured fragments of the sky. Children from across Rockport, many from families who lived on the margins, some in foster care, others simply hungry for space to run, poured into the grounds. Their laughter, high and constant, mingled with the calls of gulls and the soft creak of rope swings hastily tied to branches. Everett Cole was not in his usual uniform of pressed suits and polished shoes. Instead, he wore a plain blue work shirt rolled at the sleeves, sturdy brown trousers, and scuffed boots that had belonged to his father, a fisherman who had never lived to see his son turn 20. Everett's hazel eyes, once sharp with suspicion, now softened as he lifted a tent pole with steady strength. His hair, still dark but streaked with gray, stuck to his forehead with sweat, and for once he didn't brush it back in irritation. June and Wren ran circles around him, June with her quiet joy clutching a handful of clothespins. Wren shrieking orders at other children as if she had been born to command an army of laughter. Clarissa Boone moved among the children with the calm presence of a conductor. Her black dress had been traded for a loose shirt and slacks, her apron abandoned for the day, though her strong posture and the gentle authority in her eyes remained unchanged. She knelt to tie a shoelace, lifted a boy too small to reach the swing, and showed a group of girls how to braid long grass into bracelets. The sunlight deepened the rich tone of her skin, and when she laughed, a sound not frequent but honest, it carried like a hymn across the camp. Walt Reyes had claimed a corner of the garden near the tool shed for his rescue tent. The broad-shouldered, brown-skinned groundskeeper had gathered 3 stray dogs, a handful of injured birds, and Admiral, the one-eyed cat now holding court on a cushion. Walt's rough voice softened as he showed children how to stroke the dogs without fear, how to feed the birds carefully. Admiral, old and scarred, accepted their attention with the air of royalty, blinking his single amber eye with long-suffering patience. Marjorie Pike had set up a lemonade stand near the kitchen steps. Her short, sturdy frame bustled as she poured from glass pitchers into mismatched cups, her silver hair pinned back neatly. She barked at children not to spill and then winked when they giggled anyway. On the counter beside her, she had arranged jars of sugar cookies, each dusted with cinnamon, the same recipe Sarah used to make when Everett first brought her to Briarwall years ago. Marjorie's eyes softened each time she caught sight of June reaching for one with careful fingers. By mid-afternoon, the estate hummed like a hive. Everett paused to wipe his brow, his shirt clinging to his shoulders. As he straightened, a sleek black sedan rolled up the drive, and from it emerged 3 members of the board of his company. At the front was Richard Hanley, a tall, silver-haired man in his 60s with a perpetual frown etched into his long face. His pinstripe suit looked absurdly formal against the backdrop of children chasing bubbles. Beside him was Lydia Crane, a woman in her 50s, slim, with severe cheekbones and a gaze that could freeze a negotiation. And trailing them was Daniel Forrester, a younger executive with dark, slicked hair and eyes always darting for weakness. They stared in disbelief at the scene. Tents, paint-smeared children, animals, and Everett Cole, Billionaire founder, the man known for precision and severity kneeling in the dirt to help tie a boy's shoelace. Richard cleared his throat. "Everett," he began, his voice cold. This spectacle. Do you have any idea what liability you are exposing yourself to?" Everett stood, tall and solid, and dusted his hands on his trousers. For a moment the old instinct to defend, to argue with data, flickered in him. Then he simply closed the laptop he had brought to the porch and had left untouched all day. "There are profits that cannot be measured by quarters," he said quietly, his voice carrying in the breeze. The board members sputtered, but Everett did not engage further. He turned back to the children, kneeling once more to adjust a tent flap. His choice was made. Inside the house, June and Wren had slipped into the studio, the door now permanently open. They returned carrying the canvas Sarah had left unfinished. The painting of 2 small capes and the word "near" had been joined by their crayons, a golden sun and a wavering wave. But now, across the empty space, a 3rd cape had been painted with careful strokes of blue and white, unmistakably representing Clarissa. The word "near" had been painted bold and whole, completed not with Sarah's hand, but with the combined hands of those she had left behind. The twins carried the canvas into the garden, their small arms straining with the weight. "Daddy," Wren called. "Look!" Everett turned, saw the painting, and froze. The air seemed to still around him. He walked forward, crouched low, and studied the 3 capes. June whispered, "Now it's all of us." Everett swallowed hard, his hazel eyes wet, but he did not argue. He nodded slowly, acknowledging what they had declared. Family had widened, and he did not resist. As the sun dipped low, painting the horizon in hues of amber and rose, the children gathered on the grass, exhausted from play. Clarissa spread the blue blanket, its edges frayed, its lavender scent faint but persistent. June and Wren tugged at Everett's sleeves, urging him to sit. Clarissa lowered herself beside him, her tall figure folding gracefully, her dark eyes reflecting the lantern light. Walt leaned against a tree, Admiral perched at his boots. Marjorie bustled about, handing out one last round of lemonade before settling down herself, her face flushed but softened. From Everett's shirt pocket, as he adjusted the blanket, a small object fell, a shell, pale and ridged, with the word "Stay" carved into it. It had been tucked there years ago, one of Sarah's last hidden tokens, rediscovered that morning when Everett had dared open another drawer he had left untouched. The shell gleamed faintly in the lantern light. Clarissa picked it up and set it gently on the blanket between them. The wind moved through the chimes Sarah had once hung above the porch, a sound soft and haunting. No one spoke. No one needed to. The twins leaned into their father and Clarissa alike, their small voices breathing the only word that mattered now: home. At the end of this story, there is a lesson that speaks quietly yet powerfully into our everyday lives. Sometimes the walls we build to protect ourselves become the very barriers that keep out the light, the laughter, and the love we need most. Home is not always about a house or a perfect plan. It is about the people we allow near, the moments we choose to soften, and the courage to open the gates of our hearts. If this story touched you, I invite you to share it with someone who might need the reminder that healing often begins in the smallest acts of presence. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next story, and let this space continue to grow into a circle of light for many. May God bless you and your loved ones with peace, gentleness, and the courage to keep your Fridays soft. If you believe in the power of home, of family, and of second chances, write Amen in the comments and join this prayer with us.